audio lecture by Andrew Myers. Provided in part by my own freaking free time and my love of people, and my mom who puts up with me doing all of this stuff. Human beings have the peculiar ability to reflect on the reality of their own suffering and death. This results in a fantastic array of psychological responses, where the rational mind is left to cope with the realities of its own mortality in an ever-decaying body. One could reasonably argue that the majority of human behaviors and social interactions revolve around a predisposition to accept or reject the fact of death. Regardless of our acceptance or rejection of it, death is an inevitability. It is in our own interest, then, to adopt the psychological mindset that best facilitates and serves the needs of our immediate reality. The ability to observe the mundane operations of cause and effect, or what Schopenhauer refers to as the understanding, or what Buddhists refer to as mindfulness, is absolutely necessary to achieve a quality life. Here we refer to both the external good of the individual as well as the internal psychological good of the individual. For this reason, the mind must be polished and honed as if it were a gem. The body and the individual's psychology rely heavily on the clarity of the mind. Because the individual cannot define circumstance, the individual must conform to circumstance. Therefore, unless we are to bury ourselves as well as the ape that is our vessel, we must take great care of our education and sharpen our minds as much as is humanly possible. Like a sculptor with a piece of marble, it is the process of philosophy to remove the operational aspects of the mind that hinder it, and inevitably deliver it to a state of beautiful functionality. The operational mind, then, is as much limited as it is free in deliberation. The operational mind has moved beyond metacognition, or an awareness of thinking, and has adopted a position in which it is conscious of states of consciousness, or is metaconscious, or is aware of its own focus. The purpose of this lecture is to define and demonstrate aspects of a mind that has achieved metaconsciousness in hopes of helping individuals achieve it themselves. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this film, The Limitations of the Metaconsciousness. Okay. Time out. Obviously, that was just really serious. I'm sure a lot of people feel terrible after having watched that. And I think that that's because a lot of us have actually already suffered in our mundane lives from irrationality and people who have power and control over other people and they don't use it wisely. Which is why images like that, not only are they horrific, but I think that that's why they resonate with us so much, is that is to say that we already understand that when reason and virtue and empathy and all these things are not practiced, especially when it becomes more and more widespread, things can go horrifically and obscenely wrong. Okay, that being said, I think that we can all agree, especially because we don't want horrible things to happen to other people, horrible things to happen to us, horrible things to happen to our future family members, whatever, that if there was a solution to help correct these very preventable and willful things from happening in human society and in our own lives, we totally would. So what sort of follows here is a very, very, very long explanation as to how to do that. Because if it was absolutely obvious and easy, it would already be done and everyone would do it. So, come on, let's go look at some concepts and ideas together and see if we can't sort some of this stuff out. The parallaxical limit is responsible for the non-universality or general ineffectiveness of dogmatic pedagogical practice, i.e. why no method of teaching is ever infallible. This proof is a limited explanation of the metaphor of parallax as it can be related to the dynamics of student, teacher, and object. The examination of the parallax from the position of the student will be sufficient for our current purpose. Parallax, or Greek for alternation, is the phenomena where the general position of an object will appear to be different from the perspective of two different observers, i.e. the apparent shift in perspective one observes when looking out of one eye only versus the other eye. Example: if you look at the sphere with your left eye, the sphere appears to move right. With the right, it appears to move left. In mathematics, parallax is a method by which one can determine the distance x to an object O when the distance between the objects of observation D is given and the angle A from the points of observation S and T and the object are measured. Let O equal the subject of study. Let S equal the perspective of the student. Let T equal the perspective of the teacher. Let D equal the distance between the perspective of the student and teacher. Let X equal the distance between the teacher or object that the student wishes to learn, i.e. the correct knowledge of the teacher. Let the 90-degree angle equal the assumed right understanding of the teacher. Let angle A equal the assumed inaccurate understanding of the student. If the student could accurately measure angle A without assistance, then the student must know the distance D in order to calculate the distance X. The exact formula is not necessary for our purposes, but the metaphor of a contingent calculation based on certain knowledge is necessary. The distance D is representative of the distance between the perspective of the student and teacher, or the metadata, knowledge, insight, training that the teacher has of the object. The student does not have this information, nor do they have access to the assumed right understanding of the teacher that would provide the information required. The student cannot know the distance D without having achieved the right perspective of the teacher. Therefore, the student cannot solve for a distance x, and we arrive at the seemingly logical impossibility of the student's ability to learn. However, we have also assumed that the student can accurately measure the angle A, i.e. self-diagnose the incorrect aspects of their perspective. This is often not the case. The teacher cannot accurately predict the intellectual bias and incorrect perspective of the student. The teacher, then, cannot provide the student with an adequate angle A or distance D, nor can they elucidate the way by which the student acquires these things. The teacher attempts to provide information that the student substitutes for angle A and distance D, but cannot provide the student with the formula, i.e. the contingent action necessary to improve given information, required to spontaneously and creatively solve for distance x. The student then must apply teaching at random or attempt to solve for a distance x by substituting what is arbitrary information from their perspective. If they knew all of the information for distance d and angle A, they wouldn't need a teacher. For a distance d and angle A, and must also discover the formula required to solve for a distance x. Therefore, all learning is self-teaching. This is the largest obstacle in the pursuit of virtue, wisdom, compassion, etc. The student of these things must first be able to comprehend the value of them, determine what examples are demonstrative of these principles, and must be able to self-improve autonomously, spontaneously, creatively, or without aid. Example 1. Hammer and nail. In our first example, the apparently simple task of hammering a nail is presented in relation to the principles that were already established and our graph. Here, the novice must intuit the subjective knowledge of the master carpenter, like strike force, and be able to observe the empirical data of the master carpenter, like grip, angle of strike, safe practices, etc. Any information from the master carpenter, if not already understood and accounted for by the perception of the novice, is, at best, adopted ignorantly or, at worst, incomprehensible until the novice understands the metaphorical symbolic information provided by the master carpenter, i.e., the novice cannot experience the act of the master carpenter hammering a nail and must discover it independently or only have rote knowledge of the task. We will allow the viewer to observe the next two examples independently so that they may be able to draw their own conclusions. Example 3 continued. Language acquisition in young children is particularly demonstrative of our point. A child cannot know the complexities of abstract sign systems, or word meaning, grammar, etc., and must intuit them through observation of the thing itself, i.e. language. In other words, the child must self-teach or learn the abstract concept of language before linguistic teaching can be comprehensible. Without the ability to construct the abstract concept of language through individual observation, the child could never learn to speak. Relevant conclusions. The degree of abstraction present in the study of the object increases the obvious necessity of self-teaching. The more abstract the concept, or the more subjective or invisible the necessary information is, the greater the need for individual observation. Concepts with empirical demonstration, or anything that may be observed with the sense, i.e. hammer and nail, i.e. archery, still requires self-teaching, but the ability of the teacher to demonstrate what competence looks like increases the odds of success and accessibility. What does the taste of a masterful artisan look like? Obviously, taste plays a significant role in real-time decision-making, but it is ineffable. Any information that is comprehensible to the student already correlates with what they have already directly observed and understood. The teacher confirms things already discovered by the individual. What is taught is simply random distance d or angle a information that the student then applies to further self-teaching and observation. Our discussion of epistemology is not necessarily concerned with the obvious mundane truisms often presented in epistemological discussions. Rather, we are concerned with the limitations of the function of the mind itself and the implications that can be derived from those limitations. First, the mind is often predisposed to believe one of three things about the truth itself. The observer may believe that the truth is something concrete and absolutely tangible. As is shown here, it is almost as if the truth is all-encompassing and something that may be held in the hand. The observer may also come to believe that the truth is something that is inaccessible to the human mind or is only represented in a second-hand fashion, almost like the image reflected from a spoon or a mirror. Finally, the observer may come to the conclusion that the truth is entirely abstract, or, as Nietzsche might say, the truth is that there is no truth. The human perception, then, would almost be like the image reflected in a funhouse mirror, a complete and total distortion of actual reality. We won't even discuss nihilism or absolute nihilism as a concept due to the refutation here presented. If existence is absolutely nothing, or there is no substantive existence, then existence would be equivalent to absolutely nothing, or the inherent existence of existence would be substantively non-existent. Therefore, absolute nihilism is incomprehensible or nonsensical. A statement cannot be made that validates this theory that is not a contradiction in terms. If absolute nihilism is a contradiction in terms, any statement is a truth statement. If this is the case, nihilistic statements and substantive truth statements are equivalent in that they both posit a substantive truth. Truth, then, lies within the confines of the epistemological limit. What follows is the reconciliation of the perspectives of all three truth observations, i.e., concrete, representational, or totally abstract. The circle of epistemology divides the epistemological question into three distinct zones. The innermost ring, labeled Unknowable Original Cause, refers to the underpinnings of reality itself. An example of such a thing would be God or a specific empirical cause. This is the domain of theology and rational science. This innermost ring affects the aesthetic conjecture of the philosopher, the cause of which we will discuss later. The second ring, labeled immediate reality, refers to the obvious and immediate experience of the subjective observer. This is the domain of practical philosophy and supposedly hard sciences. This second circle is also the intended aim of all practical and philosophical endeavor. In other words, any observable effect that practical or philosophical pursuits have appear solely in this ring. The outermost space, labeled too large to comprehend, literally refers to the incomprehensible nature of some questions and problems. The endeavor to intellectually engage with anything that falls in this space is the subject of conjecture and chance alone. Therefore, anything that exists in this space lies outside of the ability of the reason to comprehend. In other words, anything that exists here is irrational. In the first example, we have an allegorical representation of a monk experiencing gnosis, or a communion with God. In this picture, the presupposition of God exists as the original cause, or the individual depicted does not believe that the original source is unknowable. Therefore, the individual with such a presupposition will observe mundane reality in such a way as to include mystical or divine subjective experience. In our second picture, we have an allegorical representation of the genius of the human mind as it blooms from DNA. Such an individual that has made the presupposition that reality spawns from an empirical source assumes that genetics and competitive evolution, etc., are the source of all things, and leaves no room for mystical or divine experience. In our third picture, we have an allegorical representation of the ideologies presented in ascetic and monastic traditions, in which the individual, isolated from society, achieves happiness through diligent study. Such an individual does not make any presuppositions about the innermost circle or unknowable cause. They, however, in their observation of mundane reality, have elevated the act of study to something most sacred. Our fourth picture begins with a quote from Newton: "I frame no hypothesis, for whatever is not deduced from the phenomena is to be called a hypothesis, and hypotheses, whether metaphysical or physical, whether of occult qualities or mechanical, have no place in experimental philosophy." Here, Newton states that the innermost circle is of absolutely no importance to the observation of cause and effect and reality. An individual with such a perspective elevates mundane observation and nothing else. Our fifth picture begins with a quote from Einstein: "The human mind, no matter how highly trained, cannot grasp the universe." In other words, having recognized that the original cause is unknowable, such an individual also admits that the observation of mundane reality is also subject to skepticism. Therefore, this individual places the absolute end of knowledge into the outermost space, or defines it as something that is ultimately too large to comprehend. Conclusion. The perception of truth as either concrete, representational, or abstract relies on the individual's adopted presuppositions about the original cause, which, in turn, alters the aesthetic of their mundane observations. However, each perspective is intimately tied to immediate implications in mundane reality. As we try to observe size as a limiting factor in epistemology, it is perhaps easier to just demonstrate this principle rather than attempt to explain it. If you would be so kind, please now pay attention to your screen. You will be shown a brief image in which a certain number of white circles will appear on a black field. Please attempt to determine the number of circles that appear. Prepare yourself as we are about to begin. Example 1. If you determined that one circle appeared on the field, you were absolutely correct. In this particular example, the level of accuracy and the immediacy of your comprehension of the answer was resoundingly clear. Now we will move on to the next example. If you determined that there were 3 circles, you were correct. Like the first example, comprehension was immediate and obvious. We will now begin our next example. Unlike the first 2 examples, in this instance, with the exception of very few individuals, this picture was incomprehensible. Let's try this example again, but this time a certain amount of order will be imposed onto the circles. This time, when organization was imposed onto the circles, the observer most likely experienced a greater amount of clarity. At the very least, they determined that the number was definitely greater than 4, and if the answer wasn't determined outright, they also probably intuited that the number was less than 10. Let's look at the example one more time, but in this instance we will prolong the amount of time that the image appears on the screen. Now it is quite clear that the number of circles is 9. Let us compare the amount of time that it takes to immediately comprehend the first group of 9 circles and the second group of 9 circles. In all likelihood, the viewer had more time than was necessary to count the 9 unorganized circles that appeared on the field. Now let us see how much time it takes to comprehend the second set. Again, the viewer probably had more time than was necessary. However, the first picture contained 5 seconds of time, and the second picture contained only 2 seconds of time. Let us now look at our last example. Obviously, the viewer understood immediately that these numbers were very organized. However, despite the clarity of the organization, the number was absolutely incomprehensible. Let us examine this example again. This time, the viewer was given approximately 10 seconds. The individual's ability to determine patterns in real time decided whether or not they were able to determine that 99 circles appeared on the black field. Conclusion. Due to the incredibly limited nature of immediate comprehension, the majority of rational calculation is subject to a relatively large margin of error. In other words, the greater the distance a given topic lies outside of immediate comprehension, the greater the risk of catastrophic miscalculation, and the amount of time required to make accurate calculation, given adequate organization, increases. Therefore, human knowledge is heavily limited by the scope of immediate comprehension and the capacity of the reason to calculate subjects that are unorganized or made innumerable without the adequate time to comprehend their number. By absolutism, we refer to the idea that some object or action is absolutely good or absolutely bad. This concept exists merely as idea, or in other words, it exists as a type of genre of thought. Let the coordinate plane represent the quantitative position of an object on the y-axis, as it is related to the qualitative perception of the observer along the x-axis, i.e., how the object is seen as being of quality or good or bad, etc., in relation to how the object actually is, or the real aspects of the object. In the right-hand corner of the coordinate plane, we see a positive perception with positive aspects. In the left-hand corner, the top left-hand corner, the negative perception with positive aspects. The lower left-hand, the negative perception with negative aspects. And the right lower corner, the positive perception with negative aspects. In order to be direct and clear, I will use an example that lies at an extreme. Although this method of analysis can be utilized to justify horrible actions, this is not its intended purpose. Rather, when appropriately limited by the circle of epistemology, one should utilize this method of analysis to arrive at a more humane and peaceful mode of being. Suppose that we have 3 individuals, a neutral observer who witnesses one individual murdering another. Obviously, for one individual, this is a negative action as it will take their life. However, we are concerned with the perception of the observer and not necessarily the action between the murderer and the victim. That is to say that we are concerned with how the observer indexes the act of murder. Outside of religious principle and the individual's general distaste for violence, After all, there are many human beings and very few murderers. We find the rational criticism of murder itself. In our minds, we generally consider murder to be absolutely bad. However, through analysis, we actually come to understand our own perception as being much more complicated. Or, in other words, the generally fast-held perception that murder is ultimately bad, or the absolute perception that murder is ultimately bad, is refuted. Now, pay close attention to your own impressions as 4 different scenarios are presented. Suppose you observe a victim of a serial murderer that gains the upper hand in a struggle and kills the would-be murderer while struggling and escapes. Generally, the individual's impression would be that in such an instance or scenario, the victim would be rather blameless in defending themselves. In this instance, the murder is thwarted, the serial murderer is no longer an operative agent in society, and his intended victim would escape. This generally has a positive perception and a positive consequence. The other 3 scenarios are presented on the screen, and I will allow the observer to come to their own conclusions. However, outside of a certain sort of idealism, I believe each one of us would recognize that our own perception of murder as something that is absolutely bad is not necessarily true. Relevant conclusion. Eudaimonic ethics can only be judged in hindsight. Ideal or absolute ethical systems may be judged by the same hindsight criteria, but their success is contextual, i.e., every situation must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Final note. Extreme thought experiments, like this one, are not designed to justify the act it considers in itself. It is, however, designed to cause reflection on ethical presuppositions that we all hold which, if we are uncritical of them, cause us to create discord and to judge prematurely or incorrectly. Although this method of thought experiment is extreme, it is nonetheless a relevant practice.